Welcome to the Social Media Detox Podcast. I am Teague, and I'm so excited to be joined by a licensed clinical social worker, Andrew Susskind. You are so lovely to come in and talk to us today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And I know you have more titles to your name. Can you say it all?
Sure.
It's a mouthful, but I think it's important to know everything you specialize in.
Sure. So I'm a brain spotting and somatic experiencing practitioner, and I'm also a certified group psychotherapist.
Okay, great. So what does your day-to-day look like? That's kind of a lot of work you do.
Sure. So I'm in private practice in Santa Monica, and so I work mostly with individuals and groups. And day to day, I work with anyone who's struggling and wants to have a bigger, better life, basically. I work with relationships, addictions and trauma. I work with everyday depression, anxiety, issues that really are getting in the way of someone wanting to move forward with their lives.
Okay. And can you tell me, if people are not familiar with what brain spotting is, can you tell us like what that looks like for a client?
Sure. It's a longer answer, but what I'll say about it is that brain spotting and somatic experiencing, which are separate trainings but overlap in some ways, are nervous system regulation modalities. Meaning that they work with the mind-body connection, and they work with issues that are at the time were too much to deal with. Usually trauma, as an example, is something that at the time is just too much to process, right? Too much to digest. And so it gets stored in what we call the subcortex. And I'm not going to go into the neuroscience of it.
You could if you wanted to.
but the easy thing to remember is that they're really modalities that work with the nervous system so that people feel more like themselves more of the time.
Great. So you work with people. Who do you typically work with?
Well, a lot of people come to me who have some kind of trauma in their background. And honestly, most of us have some kind of trauma in our background. So really someone whose trauma has gotten in their way and become a barrier to living their life the way they want to. So that's the kind of person that typically asks specifically for the nervous system work.
And what kind of change do you see in people?
Well, the good news is the nervous system is really resilient. And what happens is when they come to me, oftentimes they're feeling dysregulated, meaning that they're feeling maybe really anxious or even panicky. They're feeling hypervigilant. They could be feeling disconnected, dissociated, really depressed. And what I see is that they end up feeling their feelings without it taking over, that they end up feeling the fullness of life, and that they have the capacity to work with really anything that comes their way.
That is amazing work that you do.
Thank you.
And very admirable. So because this podcast is about social media and social media detoxing, I want to hear a little bit about how you see social media pop up for your clients.
It's a great question. I personally have a love-hate relationship with social media.
Don't we all?
Of course. Exactly. And a lot of my clients also have a love-hate relationship, even though they may not know it, right? I'll ask questions like, how often are you on social media? And they'll say, oh, not that much, maybe 6 to 8 hours a day.
Yeah, right. Just a side hustle.
Exactly.
Just another job.
That's right. That's right. And so that's a clue that sometimes people don't even realize it's a problem. So we have to talk about it in terms of, well, how is it working for you? What purpose does it serve? And what's getting in your way? How many consequences do you possibly have? Is it something that you do automatically without even thinking about it? So there's all kinds of ways to start the conversation around, is this truly a problem? In other words, is this compulsive? Or is this something that really is enriching you? Because it can go either way, of course.
Right. So what types of issues do people bring up when they talk about social media? Do you think, I know we've talked a little bit offline about social media and it not being classified technically as an addiction by the World Health Organization.
Right.
But it can show up like that. It can present in a way that looks like you're dependent on social media.
Right.
Do you see that in your clients, and what type of, how do you spot that?
Sure. So what I want to say briefly about the World Health Organization is they are the leaders in mental health around the world.
Yeah.
They're the gold standard. But it takes time for them to catch up. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. But in a clinical setting in my office, what I see is people coming to me because they're just miserable in their relationships. That time and time again, they're getting sometimes involved with people that they've never even met.
No way.
Yeah.
Right.
And having these fantasy relationships, as an example. Mm-hmm. And this is all through social media, of course.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's very fulfilling and exciting and thrilling, actually.
Yeah.
And then at other times, it's really heartbreaking and terribly degrading sometimes. I mean, I've heard stories where people can get abusive or can get belittled. And so, of course, that's the same thing that can happen in real life. Mm-hmm. But in social media, it really turns into really heavy duty bullying at times.
Right. And so when you've seen people who have been in relationships, does it end up ever working out? Do you see it? We've seen shows like 90 Day Fiance. We've seen shows like Catfish, which is a different spectrum.
For sure.
Have you ever seen that become something beneficial, having relationships that turn into something, or is it
I would,
you might not hear the good news. You might hear when they have a problem. So
but what I hear is people are learning along the way what's working and what's not working, right?
Okay.
So oftentimes social media becomes this automatic pilot where people are not being mindful of how they're using it, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So hopefully through our conversations, through therapy, we're talking about mindful use of social media. Mm-hmm. How can you approach it from a perspective of what am I really doing? Can I observe myself when I'm on social media? Can I give this a chance to see if it's something that's depleting me or enriching me? Is this something that's really going to be helpful or not? So to answer your question, it's probably the exception to the rule that healthier relationships come out of social media. Mm-hmm. But I haven't been keeping stats. So, yeah. So you're right. I mean, my population is a little bit skewed.
Right. Yeah. You're hearing the issues.
Yeah.
Which is great work that you're doing. But while we're talking about this, just really quickly, I want to hear your opinion about AI. And I know it's an evolving thing and we're just learning so much about it now, but I've heard stories about people falling in love with these chatbots. Have you seen anything like that in your work? Are you worried about working with clients when it comes to that? I mean, or is it a helpful tool for people?
Right. I don't know if it's the clientele that I work with, but I haven't run into that too much.
Good.
And I hope I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, because there have been even like stories about parents who have given their children chatbots or like kind of like a robot to be their friend because they weren't making friends in school. And it's just very interesting conversation of, is that good because you're helping your child, you're giving them, some sort of partnership, companionship, or are you hurting them in the long run? It's an interesting conversation.
Right. I know because I work mostly with adults, my hunch is that there's more going on with teenagers and even younger than that speaks to what you're bringing up.
Yeah.
I haven't run into it a whole lot in my practice. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. And there's also, I'm almost done with my side tangents, but I also saw a story about men and women hooking up with these robots. Mm-hmm. So I really hope that doesn't happen because that's a world I don't want to live in. Yeah.
It reminds me of the movie Her with Scarlett Johansson, which I thought was actually very provocative and very cutting edge.
Right.
And at the time I thought, oh, this could never happen. Right.
Yeah. Crazy.
And now it's happening. So who knows what's to come.
Exactly. And Ex Machina, did you ever watch that?
Yeah.
Same thing.
Sure.
Crazy.
Same thing.
Oh gosh. So insane. So I think it's particularly interesting. We have had a lot of people on the podcast who have talked about teens and developing young adults. And I think it's interesting to have you here because you work with fully developed adults who are chronologically. Yes. and but you still do see the effects of social media coming up for them as well, right? I mean, it's interesting. I think sometimes we're like, oh, kids are more affected by it. But I think it does affect adults as well, right?
Absolutely. I always say that there are certain activities that hijack the brain. And social media is absolutely one of them, that it can be such a useful tool in so many ways. And it can also be such a precarious and dangerous tool in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting because I don't think there's an age limit to how it can cause problems for people.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that there's really an important balance here, because I don't want to totally badmouth social media. I think
mm-hmm.
that, for instance, recently with the fires here in Los Angeles, there's a lot of useful information that was disseminated and that we were able to track what was happening in our community, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's certain uses of it, and there's certain mindful uses of it that are really, I think, what hopefully we can all benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting. Like I was saying too, when the fires were going on, I was locked into my phone. I was glued to my screen,
Right.
and it was helpful to have it, but I was probably on my phone like 8 hours a day, just constantly on the phone, which does take a toll. And I think in the mornings too, especially, it's like if you wake up and your brain isn't even fully awake, but you're filling your head with the jargon of social media, I think that's when I really notice
Exactly.
a big difference. So we were talking about, adults being affected by this, and kind of, I sometimes feel like we pretend like adults are more evolved, and then I think especially too, girls are better talking about it than guys.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've noticed this shift, and maybe it's just the people I'm hanging out with, but my dad, guys I've dated are way more locked into their phones than they were before. It used to feel like it was like, all my girlfriends were addicted to Instagram or shopping online, and girls, it was kind of like a girlier thing. And now I feel like men are really becoming more locked into their phone and addicted to phone. Have you noticed that shift at all? And they don't talk about it either, which I think is interesting. So it's like, it's this weird thing that like all of them are doing it, but we're not acknowledging it. So we're pretending like it's not a problem.
Right. I mean, I was just talking to a friend of mine who teaches community college.
Mm-hmm.
And years ago, he used to have to tell his class to be quiet before he got started.
Mm-hmm.
His classes are silent before his lecture because they're on their phones. So they're not connecting with one another. They're connecting with someone or some entity on their phone. And so I mentioned that only because I don't know the gender differences, but I think it's across the board. And you're right. I think women are socialized to talk more. Men are socialized to not talk as much. But I wanted to come back to something briefly.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about compulsion in general, I think about three things. The first thing is, how consuming is the activity, right? Is it all consuming from the time you wake up till the time you go to bed, which is often the case with social media.
Right.
Number two, if somebody wants to stop or maybe moderate their behavior, are they able to? So if they want to stop but they can't, that's another indication of something's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like the hijacking. And then lastly, of course, is consequences. Are there consequences? Are there consequences with relationships? Are there consequences with work? Are there consequences with depression or shame or anxiety? So anything that falls into those particular criteria usually is a compulsive behavior. And I apply that to compulsive sexual behavior, to workaholism, to video gaming, to really anything, food, anything that we reach for to try and distract ourselves or to shift or try and actually regulate our nervous system.
Right. So when you see that in your clients, whether it's any type of addiction, what are your typically your first step? Is it the mindfulness is a big part of it, obviously?
Sure. I mean, I come from a 12-step background myself, and in my practice, I borrow from it. So, for instance, the first step in the 12 steps is admitting that it's a problem, basically, right? So, does
the
a
hardest
client,
part, probably.
it's really hard, yes, because oftentimes someone feels so married to the behavior, and it may serve a purpose, right? It may help them feel more in control somehow. It may help them feel more um, more able to choose if and when they want to pay attention to their relationship or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think the first piece is, can we look at it as something that is getting in their way, that's depleting them, that they want to change, and then we go from there.
And then how long do you typically work with clients? Is it an ongoing thing? Is it forever? You know, what does that look like?
Almost forever. A lot of my clients are long term, so it could be anywhere from a few years to many years.
Right.
And I see people typically on a weekly basis. I also do a lot of group therapy, and in my groups, people will stay for extended periods of time. It could be a few years, or it could be many, many years. But these are really folks who are interested in deeper healing and not just fixing a problem.
Right, putting a Band-Aid on it.
Exactly, but truly understanding themselves better and wanting to have an internal life that works better for them.
Okay. And forgive me for not knowing this, but tell me exactly what group therapy looks like. Is it like putting a lot of people that have the same issue together? Is it, is it just like families? I don't know how it works. I don't know.
It's a great question. Yeah. There are many, many, many types of group therapy. Okay. I do what's called interpersonal process groups. Okay. So the folks who come to my groups have already been in individual therapy, have already identified their issues, they've been working on their issues, but they're interested in getting more feedback. So they enjoy the feedback from me, but sometimes I'll say to them, it feels like you might want to consider group, which I sometimes call postgraduate work. and what we do is we talk about it for a few sessions and decide, okay, so are they feeling like they want to learn more about themselves in the context of others? And are they interested in helping others learn about themselves? So that's a core piece. Then another piece of it is, are they open to honest feedback, and are they open to giving honest feedback, right? So my groups are really based on relationship development and experiencing deeper contact with one another and with oneself. So it's kind of like, you could think of it as a microcosm of the real world. Like there's some people you'll gravitate to, there's some people you might not gravitate to, but they're always building respect and trust for one another, and they're learning how to work with whatever comes up for them internally, which sometimes can be really lovely and sometimes can be really painful. But we talk about it. We put thoughts and feelings and sensations into words.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic.
Yeah, it feels powerful because it feels like there's so much value in finding people that are going through the same experience that you're going through. Because there's definitely value in talking to someone like you, but there's probably, it's probably a different conversation when it's somebody who's going through the exact same thing you're going through and working through it at the same time. So.
Exactly. And by the way, several of my groups are just men's groups.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And
that is important work.
I agree.
Okay. We got to get those men in therapy.
All I can tell you,
something I will say.
Thank you. I agree, T. What I can say about these men is that they're exceptional.
Yeah.
That they're willing to take the risks, be themselves fully, and be around other men who are interested in doing the same. It's very beautiful work to witness.
I love that. And I love, in a society that is so masculine and they don't want to talk about their problems and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
To hear that there are men getting together in these groups and trying to become better.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, what kind of things do you guys discuss in groups like that with men specifically? Is it always different? Or
it is, but the core is relationships. Okay. Relationships with men in the room, relationships with family, relationships with work colleagues, relationships with themselves. That's, I would say, the core piece. But really anything that someone talks about in therapy gets talked about in group therapy. So hopefully there can be a lot of honesty around issues that don't always get talked about. So in my men's groups in particular, and my mixed gender group, sometimes talking openly about sex and sexuality, which often is taboo, right?
Right.
But talking about it in a productive and safe enough way. Another topic that often gets overlooked in general is money and finances. And it's not so much
pressure of all that.
Oh my gosh, especially in Los Angeles.
Right, right.
But the thing about money is that we're not talking about what's in your checking account. We're talking about your relationship with money, right? So that's something that in families and even with friends often doesn't get talked about. And in group, it's very tender actually for people to really talk about some of the challenges and some of the pitfalls that they run into around sex and money, kind of the two taboo subjects.
Right, absolutely. Well, why do you think men in particular have, I mean, maybe you don't, but do you think they have a difficulty talking about that outside of a setting like that? You know, if they go to brunch and they just bring that up, I feel like all their friends are going to look at them like, what? We're watching a football game. You
That's
know,
right.
Why do you think that has been a problem for men over the years?
I just think we're socialized, actually men and women to some extent.
True. Yeah.
Not to talk about those issues, like somehow they're off limits, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of silly because sometimes they can be the most challenging parts of life, right? For instance, how can we have a sex positive experience with ourselves and with others, right? It doesn't often get talked about in a way that is helpful. You know, often we you know, I think teenagers sometimes learn from social media. And we all know that the information that social media shares can be accurate at times or not so accurate at times. So imagine all these kids becoming adults and then they're kind of left like, oh, but I was told that this is how you're supposed to masturbate or something of that notion. Right. And what we do really is we work on breaking myths and working on how can you have a more congruent relationship in such a way that really is not going to be some kind of big bad secret.
Right. Okay. Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And really important work.
Yeah.
So very commendable. How did you get into all this work? Did you start? Is this what you were originally going to do?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
I want to say it's kind of a joke, but it's not. That I knew I was going to be a therapist in utero.
And why do you say that?
It's the family I was born into without going into all of that.
Oh my gosh, how funny.
I grew up in a very complicated family.
Okay.
And so I was the mediator. I was the one who was the problem solver. I was the one that listened really well and helped people kind of figure things out. And so from a very young age.
That's a gift. So when you say you were born into it, were people in your family therapists? Did they work in that space?
Interestingly enough, my dad's sister, my Aunt Ruth, is the main reason I live in Los Angeles. I moved here 37 years ago, but she was a psychologist when she was practicing. And so I followed in her footsteps for sure.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Before we get back to the social media stuff, I just want to know, like, your first, just because I think this is interesting, it's an interesting career. What was the first day or maybe the first client where you had a breakthrough and you were like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy I'm doing this? Was there like a moment or like a story you can remember of like, I am so happy that I'm able to do this type of work?
So I was really lucky that I had really strong and structured internships. And so in school, one year I was at the VA, the Veterans Administration.
Oh my gosh, important work.
It was great.
Yeah.
And the second year I was at UCLA working with kids and families in their outpatient hospital. And from the get-go, I felt so lucky, so grateful to be with them, that people would come to me and want to come back. That was the big surprise.
Of course, you're so lovely.
Thank you. But at the time I was young. I was in my 20s and I didn't have a whole lot of confidence. But I felt that there was something from the get-go where I could tell that just coming in and having someone to listen to them was healing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just that. It wasn't that I had to say a certain thing or do a certain thing, just being with them. And I felt it from the beginning. Yeah.
That's amazing. Oh, well, my last question about your career is, do you feel like because you do this work, do you feel like your relationships benefit from that? Or is it hard to separate your own relationships with your work? Like, do you bring that home and say, actually, we could do this differently because this is something I know and I learned, or can you
Right.
not do that?
No, what I do is I'm a big believer in healing the healer. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've been in therapy since I was a teenager.
Oh, wow.
And so I have my own therapist. I have a consultant that I work with. And so I'm constantly trying to keep sharp. And so for sure, I think what I bring home has benefited from my career because I know myself much, much, much better than I used to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also human, so I make mistakes, and hopefully I deal with them quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it all kind of blends in at some point, and I feel again just very blessed that I have the kind of career that I do.
Right, right. Oh, wow. Well, I'm obsessed. Um, I want to talk a little. Let's go back to the social media thing. So in your work as a somatic experiencing practitioner, you focus on the connection between the body, the mind. How does the body react to overstimulation when it comes to social media use? Does it
Right.
contribute to addiction-like behaviors?
Sure. It can go in a lot of directions. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's a cookie cutter answer for what you're asking.
Okay.
But I think what happens is the nervous system, as resilient as it is also an information keeper. And so if there's something going on where there's too much, where there's overwhelm in some way or another, what happens is either someone can what we call upregulate, and if they upregulate they can get really really anxious, they can get really hypervigilant, they can just feel on edge quite a
Mm-hmm.
bit, and of course that's a lot of work for the nervous system to do. Or on the other hand, some people, when they get overwhelmed, can downregulate and feel disconnected, feel depressed, feel dissociated, feel shut down. And
Mm-hmm.
so actually it can go in either direction. And so everybody's nervous system, depending on their history and what they've been through in their life, can go in one direction or the other. In a way, what we're looking at is when somebody either upregulates or downregulates, we're looking at how can we help the nervous system come back to its homeostasis, right? Its
Mm-hmm.
natural state.
Right.
And so that's really the healing direction.
So when you talk about regulation, does the dopamine effect, does that come into it at all? On social media, they talk about, dopamine and the addiction. And is that something you try to regulate?
Yeah, well, regulation as a term
Mm-hmm.
really means experiencing the fullness of one's internal life. So if we're talking about feelings and we're talking about thoughts and we're feeling about images, hopefully if we're regulated, we feel the capacity to hold everything that life has to offer, right?
Right.
It's not like necessarily a pleasant thing or an unpleasant thing. It's just both,
You're there.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So in terms of regulation, when we're talking about social media, it's not something that I have studied, and I really think we're at the very, very, very beginning of understanding the effects of social media. But what I see is that there's a lot of shame, tremendous amount of shame, because people are feeling not enough. People are doing a lot of comparison, and so shame is a tremendous um, barrier to feeling regulated, right? So that's a clue to me that there's something off, right? So that's just one example, but there's so
Mm-hmm.
many that are affected when somebody's online for many, many hours a day.
Right. Right. Okay. That's great. And it's just like, how do we get out of the cycle? How do we get out of the cycle? Even
Yeah.
like, we're talking about a social media detox too. Do you think that's something that is helpful for people if they get offline? Or is it more just like trying to be more mindful and going forward that way? Or have you seen that
Well,
work?
I think it's uh, again not a one size fits all answer,
Right.
right? That I think taking a break from a behavior that has been all consuming or that has been just feels like it's been draining for you, that's a really important thing to do. Now, sometimes I'll say to a client, would you be willing to just go off social media for a week? What do you think they say to me?
They can't do it.
Can't do it.
Wow.
Or don't want to do it. They're not willing to do it.
And sometimes I think they might even tell you, and tell me if I'm wrong, they might say, it's not a problem. What are you talking about?
Exactly.
It's not a big deal. I'm just looking at cat memes.
That's right.
But it could be a problem, actually.
Right.
Very interesting.
But until they identify it as a problem, and that's not my job to tell them this is a problem. My job is to be curious with them, hopefully build their curiosity around it. I want to be non-judgmental about it as best I can, and for them to be non-judgmental about it, but to really investigate and put some oxygen into the conversation around how does this fit in your life? And then we decide, hopefully, what if you took 2 days off of social media?
Yeah.
And so that might be a bite-sized chunk that they'd be willing to do. It's really like any compulsive behavior. It's really like a negotiation with oneself, but it's also a negotiation with a person that they can be accountable to. I don't consider myself an accountability person per se, but I usually ask them if they have someone in their life that they're willing to be accountable to, almost like a sponsor in 12-step, right? So that they don't have to do it alone, because oftentimes trying to do it alone just doesn't work.
Right. So if you have had clients who have successfully gotten off of social media for a few days, have you seen a change in their, whole vibe?
Well, what happens actually, it's interesting, Teague, because everybody is a little bit different. So what I'm looking for is there any movement at all? Right? Even if it's glacial, I'm curious if there's something they noticed that was different. Did they sleep better? Did they eat more nutritious food? Did they spend more time with their loved ones? So I'm trying to get a sense, right, with them of what's working and what's not working, so that they can start monitoring it. We can keep an eye on it. Hopefully they can have an accountability person of some sort. And then we just go from there. And sometimes it's really, really slow. And sometimes someone's like, I'm just going cold turkey. I can't do this anymore. And we see how that goes.
Wow, that is interesting. And when you say, eating healthier, I do think it's sometimes when you're mindfully or, mindlessly scrolling online, it feels easy to do. Like, I can mindlessly also snack, and I can also mindlessly do this other stuff, and I can also put off work. And it just feels like just this like kind of like snowball effect of doing things in a way that you're just like not even acknowledging what you're doing.
Right.
So I think it is just like waking up and being more mindful is probably step one.
Right. And part of the mindful mentality is noticing what else is going on for them. I have a psychiatrist colleague who says he will never prescribe until somebody is paying close attention to what they're eating, to how they're sleeping, and to their exercise. And that once they're paying attention to the basics, then he'll see where they are, right? But it can be very different, right? So I always want to look holistically at what's going on for someone, because I don't want to just say, stop. I want to help them make an informed decision for themselves.
Right. Well, Andrew, I am such a fan of you, and I appreciate you coming in so much. So if anybody listening here today would like to get a hold of you, how can we reach you?
Sure.
What would that look like?
Sure. So my website is westsidetherapist.com. That's all one word, singular, Westside Therapist. And that's really the best way to get a hold of me and check out what I do in my practice, look at the books that I've written and all kinds of information, my podcast, everything that,
I love it.
thank you. So that's the best place to begin.
Okay, great. And then before I let you go, any closing thoughts on social media, on what the future looks like, on what we should be aware of?
Yeah.
Just good luck.
Right. Right. That's probably the first
sentiment.
Exactly. And when it comes to social media, I really think there's something about public awareness that needs to trickle down into the mental health field and into the offices of clinicians and really in general, families and schools, et cetera. And, my thing about social media is you don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's so many possible uses of social media that can really be meaningful. And yet there's also this other side where it's kind of taking over and, as we've talked about, hijacking the brain. So more than anything, I think we're just at the very, very starting gate of understanding through research, through academia, through neuroscience. And it is a little bit precarious. It's a little bit unknown territory. But I hope in 5 or 10 or 20 years, we'll have a much different conversation.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you so much for being on the podcast, and you're the best. And we'll talk to you soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.